Today, we're going to build a rotating Quake quad. Welcome to Maker's Digest. One of my all-time favorite games is Quake 1 from ID Software, released back in 1996. I've sort of recently discovered that there's a ton of new content being released by the community that's far better than the original stuff that was released back in 1996. Anyway, I thought it'd be fun to do a series of builds around Quake, and while I was figuring out how to extract the models from the game to 3D print, I found the quad model. That's the artifact that gives you quad damage. It's also the logo for the game. In the game, it kind of floats in the air and rotates at about 35 RPMs, and I thought it would be cool to make one of those for my desk, and that's what this episode is. Modifying the model for printing, designing a base for it, and the electronics. It's got a small 30 RPM gear motor, micro USB power supply to supply the 5 volts, and a switch to turn it off and on. So let's dive in and see how I made it.
The first thing I had to do was import the model into Fusion 360. I had to run it through a couple of different programs to get it into a mesh object file that Fusion would accept. You can see that Fusion doesn't handle mesh right out of the gate very well. It's got all these rounded features. But if you convert it to a BREP model, which stands for boundary representation, it shows the actual dimensions and allows me to do some minor tweaking to it. Then I scaled the model to be the right size for my desktop. I wanted it to be about 6 inches tall. Then I had to cut the end off so there was a place for the motor shaft to set in, so I mocked up the motor in CAD so I could use it in the assembly. I used my calipers to pull all the dimensions from the real-world object. Then I created a base to house the motor, USB, and power switch, but I wasn't happy with the first version I did, so I kind of scrapped it. It wasn't going to 3D print very well. I decided to go with a design that was a little bit friendlier for 3D printing. It's smaller and not as cool looking as the first version, but it totally worked and I'm happy with the outcome. I imported a mock-up of the switch I was going to use, mocked up the USB power widget, and then tweaked the whole thing so that it would print better. The first part to print was the actual quad itself. I didn't get it perfectly flat in Slicer, and I didn't realize that it was off a little bit, so it's got some lines on it where it was off. But I think it's going to work out because it's going to give it some texture for when I paint it. The whole thing had to be supported by support material because the head of the nail is just proud of the face of the Q part of the quad. After filing on it with some nail files for a while, I kind of decided that I liked the texture that was in there, and so I just left it. Next, I printed the base. It came out okay. There was a lot of support material inside of it and it was a bit tricky to get out. Assembling the thing was pretty easy. The parts fit just right. Very simple electronics. Got 5 volts in, positive directly to the motor, and ground broken by the switch. I epoxied the USB connector inside the base and then soldered everything together and fitted inside the base. And that's pretty much it. Still need some paint, but that's for another episode. Now I can enjoy quad damage on my desktop.